Hi, everybody. This is Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology. It's Friday, December 14th, and I'm making the second part of a three-part video series on the changes of the nodes of the moon into Cancer and Capricorn. So this is, to me, a really important subject, primarily because it's one of the topics that I get asked the most questions about. All year round, I write about astrology, and all year round, I make videos about astrology, and I teach astrology classes. And some people, you'd actually be surprised by the amount of people that I see in my client practice that know something about astrology. And therefore, a lot of the astrology sessions that I do with other people come down to interesting questions that people have about astrology, already knowing something about their charts, perhaps. And one of the most popular questions that I get from clients, students, readers, viewers has to do with the nodes of the moon, and especially when the nodes of the moon change signs. That's always when I get the most questions, or maybe eclipse season. Other times, a outer planet changes signs or something like that. I'll get questions about what the meaning of that might be. But hands down, nodes of the moon are one of the most popular topics. Now, if you haven't watched part one of this series, you might want to start by watching that part, because you'll hear me talk at length about the nodes of the moon and what their meanings were traditionally. Now, today I want to make some very simple points about the virtues and vices of both Cancer and Capricorn. I want to talk more specifically about the sort of light and dark side of the moon, as well as the light and dark side of Saturn. But the reason that I want to talk about both is I want to talk about both within the context of a main point that I made yesterday, which I'm going to repeat very briefly here at the beginning of today's talk. So the main thing that I said yesterday in yesterday's talk was that there is a story that pervades much of modern astrology about the nodes, and that is the basic idea that spiritual evolution or growth takes place sometimes in a very linear sense by moving toward the north node, and that you're moving away from the south node. I use the quote that is out there. Again, not wanting to start a turf war or anything. I just have different views about the nodes in general. Practicing traditional astrology, as I said yesterday, we don't really see anything in traditional literature supporting what we see circulating about the nodes today, that you go toward the north node and that the past life is your south node. There was a quote that I mentioned yesterday that's out there that's something like, the south node is the bottle and the north node is the meeting. I've heard that countless times and saw it resurface in the past couple of months again. And I think that that's a problematic interpretation for a variety of reasons, all of which I talked about yesterday. But I'm going to reiterate a few of the same points right now, just to contextualize what we're going to talk about. So one of the main reasons that I think that that's a problematic metaphor is that traditionally speaking, the nodes of the moon, first and foremost, have to be understood in relation to the entire philosophical territory of astrology that the moon was associated with. So in ancient astrology, the moon is related to what is broadly called fortune. And I've said this so many times, but fortune refers to all of the vacillating changes, the dualistic rotating of opposites in the material world, in this world of impermanence and constant change. You think back to ancient philosophers like Heraclitus, who famously said you can't step in the same river twice. You think of philosophers like Lao Tzu. One of the most primary ways that mystics of all different traditions have had of talking about the world around us is in terms of the changing nature of things here, that everything is constant change. That's the only constant here, is change. And just like the symbol of the yin and yang, the changes in the material world, the world of change, happen through the vacillation of opposite qualities, hot and cold, damp and dry, like this. And it goes around and around. And these are things that are the entire language of astrology is built upon an understanding of these dualities and their oppositions. For example, opposite houses have opposite meanings. Opposite hemispheres have opposite meanings. The sun and the moon have opposite meanings. The elements have opposite qualities. The masculine and feminine signs are opposites. Everything, every component of the language of astrology is built upon the understanding that in order for a language to be able to predict something about the world or describe it accurately, it has to be able to work in terms of that which is predictable. And the way that ancients saw that is that that predictability is noticed in the world through the constant cycling of opposites. So the entire language of astrology, from the synodic cycles of the planets that recur, to the cycle of the moon every month that recurs, to all of the different elements of the language of astrology, are built upon the fluctuation of opposites. The world, in a sense, is predictable at all because it is thought to be a cycling of opposites in time, which itself was thought to be cyclical by the ancient astrologers. So once you have that basic gist, that entire realm of the cycling of opposites is ruled by the moon in ancient astrology and is called the realm of fortune, just like the Wheel of Fortune card in the tarot. The Wheel of Fortune is that is sort of the most intimate picture, you might say, of the world that we live in. Okay, so when you're talking about the nodes of the moon, what you're talking about, or you're talking about the intersecting points, this is what I said yesterday, of the moon's path with the sun's path, where there is either ascension or descent relative to the sun's line of the ecliptic. And what that symbolizes is the rise of fortune or the fall of fortune. And that's very relative. Rising can be a good thing or a bad thing. That's why ancient astrologers said the ascending node is related to increase for the good or the bad. Decrease, going down toward the south, is about decrease for the good or the bad. Properly understood, the nodes of the moon have to do with karma that's blossoming in your life, that is largely unconscious, meaning there's not a lot of, it's going to happen. It's like in the long enough span of time, which we don't have always the greatest access to. We don't have vision of how long we've really been here. It's like a ball is rolling forward over the course of many lifetimes. And the nodes of the moon sort of show you that there's a momentum. There's a momentum coming, and the nodes of the moon are showing you where different waves of increase and decrease are going to be entering your life. Your spiritual evolution really has nothing to do with going towards one or the other. In the Indian system, for example, the North Node is actually looked at in pretty much exactly the opposite way that it's looked at in evolutionary astrology now. In terms of gain and increase, it's thought to be more dangerous for spiritual life to be surrounded by a lot of gain and increase. Whereas decrease and loss is thought to be a little closer, or being a little bit more conducive to getting off from the Wheel of Fortune, or getting off from being overly identified with it, we should say. Talked about all of that yesterday. In order for spiritual growth to happen, usually it has very little to do, in some ways, with the inevitable dramas that will come up in our lives around the nodes of the moon. There's a great quote from the Bhagavad Gita. I don't know the scripture well enough to have it memorized yet. Maybe someday. But basically, when Arjuna is talking to Krishna about the origins of the soul and where the soul comes from, it basically is said that, look, you've been here since time immemorial. You've been here in this material world, this realm of fortune, and I've been satisfying your desires in this world since time immemorial. Meaning, I give you the Krishna's thought of as like God. God sort of gives us the free will to do what we want here in this endless universe. It's sort of like this elaborate AI program, an elaborate matrix in which we, who are not really our bodies, can go around and do things. We can method act great Shakespearean dramas. We can imagine our way into all sorts of endless stories, right? And there's something very beautiful about it, really. But also, there is no real origin to this. The word, I'm going to mess up the word in Sanskrit, but it's like anandi or something like that, and it means beginningless, without origin. We have a really hard time thinking, mostly because of our, I would dare to say, some of our Christian theological programming, which I think we take up very unconsciously, to think of ourselves as having an origin, and then we think of ourselves as having some final destination. So insofar as the nodes are looked at in terms of past lives where you've gotten it wrong, and then future lives where you're trying to get it right, or choices now that you're trying to learn to get it right, this is really, think about what that really means when you take into consideration the idea that the jiva, or the soul, is beginningless and also without end, and is said, for example, again, in the bhakti tradition, in the yoga tradition, to be without origin. How useful is it, therefore, to spend a lot of time thinking about past lives, and then to try to construe some kind of story about what you're trying to do in this life that is based on what you didn't do right in last lives? In a sense, my argument, and I don't mean to sound too narrow about it, but I think that it's okay to have some competition of beliefs about these things. My belief is along the lines of what, a lot of great spiritual teachers have told us, like including, again, the Dalai Lama, who I've mentioned a number of times in our talks, that thinking about or getting involved in past lives is really a fruitless endeavor. It's maybe a useful metaphor. There's useful metaphorical value in thinking about past lives, right? There's a number, I think, of, I have a lot of friends who are evolutionary astrologers and stuff like that, who will tell you, you don't have to think about the past lives so literally if you don't jive with the philosophy, and I think that's pretty gracious. But I see a pretty wide trend of people thinking about the South Nodes really in terms of like where it went wrong last time. We have to ask yourself, in the scope of eternity, what are you really trying to get right? Do you know what I mean? The nodes are really in the realm of fortune, connected to the moon. The nodes of the moon are really related to the desires that are propelling the plot line, but even more directly, they are speaking to very general themes of increase and gain in the realm of fortune, or decrease and loss, either of which may be good or bad, and neither of which are really the point of spiritual progress. So sometimes I think we take this idea of some story that we're here to live in contrast to some story that we lived before. I just think we take it too far and we take it too seriously. When I ask my students, for example, I was talking to a student yesterday, and we were having a conversation about, people come in to a reading, for example, an astrology reading. And a lot of the times they'll ask the question, like, what is my purpose? Right? What is my purpose? This is a very, very modern question, in a sense. It's not bad to have a purpose. I feel like I have a sense of purpose, and I'd probably be hard pressed to give up the things that I find a lot of purpose in. You know what I mean? Like, you'd have to pry them out of my hands or whatever. But we're really kind of a purpose-obsessed culture in many ways. And so we were talking about this in readings, and when a client comes in and they say, what's my purpose? So let's say somebody comes in and, they want to know, what their purpose is, and let's say they're 40 or 50 years old. Well, they're already halfway through their life, so their purpose is already spoken for. Do you know what I mean? They've lived their purpose already, whatever it might be. But they're still asking. And I found this to be common whether a person is in their 20s or 70s doing a reading, that people are still asking about their purpose. So what gives? What's that all about? Well, again, the gist of it, as far as I can tell, is that very seldomly does our sense of purpose have anything to do with a spiritual sense of happiness that we can cultivate in life. meaning the stagecraft of our life and all the stuff that we're going to get involved in. It's sort of like that stuff's going to happen. It's just going to happen. In fact, I feel like most of that stuff is pretty predictable in astrology, at least in a general sense. I believe in free will, don't get me wrong, but I believe that astrology can show us pretty accurately how we're using our free will and what things are compelling to us and where we're likely to go. Again, in broad sort of symbolic terms and sometimes very specific ways. But when I talk to people, some of the things that I'll generally ask people is I'll say, list for me like 3 or 4 of the most spiritually transcendent moments of your life, or tell me where and when you tend to feel most connected in your heart to something that makes you feel happy beyond the material things of the world, like promotions or money or success or fitting in or loss or grief or tragedy. When have you felt most sort of self-satisfied, situated in your heart and sort of transcendentally happy? When has that been there for you? One of my students yesterday and I were talking about this, and she mentioned some things. I think she might be, Betty, if you're watching this, I'm going to call on what you said because it's really stuck with me. She said laughter has been one of the things that it's been very important to her, because with laughter, she feels something that can transcend the ups and downs of this world. Just regular, everyday laughter and sharing it with people, right? Very simple. Another thing that she mentioned was essentially time alone in nature. She had a powerful connection with a mountain one time that was very powerful. And the other one she mentioned was singing with other people. So we paused and we kind of took that in. And if I reflect, my experiences are pretty similar. The things that give me the most happiness in life, generally speaking, are things like my meditation, heart-centered space with others in spiritual community. There's like very, very basic things that really help me stay situated in what I would call my heart and in connection to something bigger than myself, which I would call God. Very little of that has to do with purpose. In fact, in those spaces to me are sometimes almost perfectly defined by being without purpose or without goal, without future and without past, without previous lives and without future lives, without things that I'm trying to do because I need to do them in this life, or things that I didn't do or messed up on in past lives, right? So purpose, I think, is a red herring. And I feel like there is a lot of spiritual materialism, which is a subtler, but just as I think problematic form of materialism that emerges in our lives and can emerge in the spiritual culture of astrology, especially around the nodes of the moon, because these are the places that are in some ways most deeply unconsciously rooted places of great gain and great loss, great acceleration and growth. Remember, north node's related to Jupiter traditionally, and gain for the good or the bad, or Saturn, south node associated with loss and decrease. Okay. What did some of our astrological ancestors say about the point of astrology? Let's read from Ficino. Ficino is one of the great Renaissance astrologers, and he is commenting. He's one of the great commenters on the Platonic tradition, in particular Neoplatonism. And it's sort of because of him that there's actually a rebirth of a lot of Platonic and Neoplatonic thinking in the Renaissance. So here's what he says this is, in what, according to Plotinus, the power of attracting favor from the heavens consists. And this is from the book on obtaining life from the heavens. And he's an astrologer as well. Here's what he says at in the end. He says, if there were only these two things in the universe, on one side the intellect, on the other side the body, but no soul, then neither would the intellect be attracted to the body, for intellect is absolutely motionless without affect, which is the principle of motion and very far away from the body. Nor would the body be drawn to the intellect, for body is in itself powerless, unsuited for motion and far removed from the intellect. But if a soul which conforms to both were placed between them, an attraction will easily occur to each one on either side. In the first place, soul is led most easily of all, since she is the primum mobile and movable of herself. What is the primum mobile? The first mover. What was the original motion of the sky related to? The primary motion, the primary mover, the source of all things, the context in which all astrology is taking place, the world soul or the cosmic soul, the divine. Moreover, since, as I have said, she is the means of things, in her own fashion she contains all things and is proportionally intellect, soul, body, near to both. Therefore, she is equally connected with everything, even with those things which are at a distance from one another, like the nodes of the moon, like Cancer and Capricorn. Therefore, she is equally connected with everything, even with those things which are at a distance from one another, because they are not at a distance from her. The soul is conceptualized as feminine, just as in the yogic tradition, God is in some ways thought of as, in the Bhakti tradition I study, is thought of as Krishna, and the jivas, the souls, are a part of a sort of a feminine energy of God that exists in an eternal relationship with God. So it's as a oneness and a difference simultaneously. And that's exactly what Ficino is saying here as well. He also, by the way, very openly associates Neoplatonism with Indian philosophy throughout a number of passages in his text. Therefore, she is equally connected with everything, the soul, even with those things which are at a distance from one another, because they are not at a distance from her. For besides the fact that on the one side she conforms to the divine, and on the other side to the transient, and even turns to each by desire, at the same time she is wholly and simultaneously everywhere. Isn't that beautiful? But what's being said to us here by this great Renaissance astrologer about the purpose of astrology? How are we to relate to the heavens in general? Well, if we relate purely from the side of the transient, then we will experience time as something that involves the past and the future. Past lives will become more of a thing. We will think about spiritual progress in terms of the past and the future. However, we turn ourselves to the divine, and it's an ever-present origin. It's an ever-present source. And when, on the other hand, we recognize that finally that we are also compelled to be in both at once, that we are in the transient world, and yet we are to keep our heart and our minds turned toward the eternal, then we learn to shift our consciousness so that we can go through this transient realm with a higher consciousness. Now, that doesn't happen when we conceptualize the nodes in some kind of linear growth paradigm. It just doesn't. Ancient astrologers didn't do it. Indian astrologers don't do it. In fact, they're even more skeptical about the growth of the North Node in particular. So where does that leave us? Again, I said I wanted to give you some context for today before we go in. Where that leaves us is with trying to understand the moon and Saturn in a deeper and more meaningful way, because as the soul, we are between all oppositions. We are the middle ground between Cancer and Capricorn. We are the middle ground where the chart is being experienced. That is why we are not our charts, and we are not a growth-oriented journey toward the North Node, and we are not a mistake from the past life in the South Node. Metaphorically, they have value, which is why I support and admire the storytelling of evolutionary astrology, because metaphorically they can have value. We have lives to live with desires that are compelling us, and it's helpful to know something about them. However, remember that for ancient astrologers, the nodes are equally compelling factors in our karma. They have to do with the general way that the world works, which is in terms of cycles of up and down. So you have to, again, zoom out a little bit. But now let's talk about the karma associated with both of them. So you guys tell me, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the moon or with Saturn? We go in Cancer or we go in Capricorn first? Someone pick one, and I'll go where you guys tell me to go. We'll start with whichever one makes the most sense. I'm going to look here at the chat box, and whoever tells me, you guys get to pick. Let me go. Okay. All right. I have Saturn. Okay, Saturn is first. Okay, might as well go. A couple of people are like, Saturn. Let's do Saturn first. Okay. First of all, a couple of things to say about Saturn. One, I'm going to say something that is probably maybe the most controversial thing you'll hear today. I don't know, hopefully. Saturn, of all of the planets, is the most like Neptune. There it is. I said it. Saturn is the planet of the ancient planets. Saturn is the planet that is most like Neptune. Before Neptune comes onto the scene, if you really want to understand Saturn, you should know that it's very similar to Neptune. In fact, when Pluto and Uranus were discovered, they were discovered at the moment that they were discovered, they were both in harsh oppositions with Saturn. But when Neptune was discovered, it was in a near perfect conjunction with Saturn. Neptune is like Saturn. Let me explain why. Saturn is the planet that's associated with winter, and winter is phlegmatic, watery, and is about death. But death is something that Saturn is associated with melancholics and cold and hard and dry, and sure, it's got all of that. But don't forget that Saturn is related to, rules over professions on the water in ancient astrology, is related to seasides, dark and rainy conditions, and is also associated with the death and dissolution, the watery deterioration of winter. So what happens if you've ever been in a nursing home? Just like children are very wet and liquidy, yeah, it's true that old people, when they're passing, are drying up and sort of shriveling. But there's also a lot of liquid involved at the end of life. There's also a deterioration. Things start drooping. Things start seeping down. Adults become a lot like babies again. And this is also Saturn's territory, traditionally speaking. It has to do with the yesterday I read this, I'll read it again now just for the sake of repetition and to really make the point. Saturn is connected with wetness and the sort of wintry quality of wetness and deterioration. Let me just read something to you guys that I came across yesterday. Saturn rules blackening, or the black. What does black intend to achieve? What is its accomplishment? This is from Alchemical Psychology by James Hillman. I'm not going to read the whole thing, don't worry. Here we go. The process most relevant for producing blackness is putrefaction and mortification. Break down the inner cohesion of any fixed state. In ancient astrology, you have to understand that most of the planets are understood themselves in terms of an internal dichotomy and vacillation of opposites within it. So one of the things I just detest about modern astrology's way of dealing with the outer planets is that most of their definitions are made in contrast to Saturn. You'll hear people saying, oh yeah, Uranus goes beyond the limits of Saturn, breaks through the paradigm of Saturn, or Pluto. People talking about the upcoming Saturn-Pluto dynamic. Oh, it's all going to be about, harsh limitations and kind of detonating them or something like that. But everyone always goes toward the cold, dry, hard Saturn. But that's only one side of Saturn, because Saturn isn't finally to be understood as a thing. It's to be understood as a multidimensional facet of the constant world of change. All planets represent process, because the world that they reflect is a world in process. And so there are elements of, we talk about them a lot of the times using words that are very static, like structure. But the planets themselves are always inherently presenting a process that has its own internal dichotomy. So, for example, Saturn as blackness, which it rules traditionally and is associated to blackness in alchemy as well. Blackness and blackening is a part of the relationship between structure and the deterioration of structure. That's why Saturn is related not just with, the crabbiness of an old person stuck in their ways, but also the deterioration of something, of youthfulness that led to a hardening, or a hardening that breaks down and dissolves. We tend to think about Neptune, for example, as the dissolver in contrast to Saturn. This is misguided because ancient astrologers really understood planets to include those kind of dichotomies within them. So Saturn already was dealing with that exact dichotomy. This is, again, something that we've lost, and Saturn has unfortunately we've become really myopic about it. So putrefaction by decomposition or falling apart, mortification by grinding down as seeds in a mortar are refined into ever thinner and smaller particles. That refining process, that breaking down process, is what leads us to all sorts of essential spirits, essential oils, essential et-ceteras. The idea of things being broken down and liquefied. Listen to this. Newton himself wrote, "For the production of black, the corpuscles must be less than any of those which exhibit colors." The thickness and solidity of the materials he worked with, Newton said, became more attenuated by fire and by putrefaction, the most subtle dissolver. The subtle dissolver, when mixed into other hues, brings about their darkening and deepening. This is what black, dark clouds, black, dark water does. We have no idea how Neptunian Saturn actually is. This is also why Saturn is related to the seventh sphere of heaven. Check this out from Dante's Paradiso. This is how, again, our Renaissance homies understood this. The soul predestined to welcome Dante in the sphere of Saturn, which is the seventh sphere of heaven, is Peter Damian. Peter left a celebrated career as a teacher and entered the Benedictine monastery at Font Avellana in central Italy, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, where he led a simple life conducive to spiritual worship and contemplation. So Saturn's also related to contemplatives, to people who stand at the edges, contemplating vastness. See how we think about that like Neptune now? That was Saturn traditionally. He reluctantly accepted his appointment. Peter became abbot in 1043 and a champion of reform and a renewal of spiritual values in church practice. He reluctantly accepted his appointment to cardinal in 1057. One of Peter's letters, his writing consists of 180 letters, some gathered into short books, contain the images of the ladder of contemplation, and another exhorts his fellow cardinals to forego lavish material comforts to live honest, simple, virtuous lives. That's also Saturn. Peter forcefully instructs Dante in Paradiso to instruct others that God's ways are ultimately cut off from human understanding and even from that of angels. This is, again, Saturn's great virtue that's often misunderstood. Saturn is not just limitation. Saturn is also the limit of limitations. Hexagram 60 in the I Ching says the exact same thing. When you reach the limit of limits, there is a great revelation. It's ecstatic, and it goes beyond, like, coming to, for example, a simple way of maybe making this more simple here. When you come to realize that you can't circumscribe divinity with your mind, right? You've used the tools of your mind very carefully, analyzed it, pursued truth. You've, in a sense, used a very Saturnine structured form of trying to approach the absolute, the divinity. And then you reach this point where you realize, my mind is limited, right? And suddenly that limitation becomes the exact, it facilitates your understanding of that which is incomprehensible. Bizarrely, it's like reaching the place where you're like, I can't understand it, is exactly the moment at which you start to understand something. This is Saturn as well, traditionally speaking. That was Saturn's role. Saturn is the one that takes you to the limits of limits. It's not just cruel, cold, hard, stupid limitations. It's also the limit of limits, which leads to the seventh sphere of heaven, where, again, Peter forcefully instructs Dante that God's ways are ultimately cut off from human understanding and even from that of angels. Right? He also launches one of the poem's most vivid assaults on church corruption and hypocrisy by contrasting the ascetic humility of two of Christianity's founding fathers, Peter and Paul, with the decadent lives lived by priests of Dante's day. This is another thing, is that Saturn, yes, rules things like greed and covetousness and hardness of heart. Ebenezer Scrooge from the Christmas Carol or whatever, like that sort of Saturn. And that's in my mind because I just saw the play. But it is also, Saturn is a revolutionary traditionally. Saturn is the one who looks upon the world from a distance and sees its hypocrisy and decides to live a simple life. One of my favorite students that I ever had, she's still a friend of mine. Her name's Elodie. Some of you guys may know her. She has an exalted Saturn in the 12th house, right? Saturn's joy. If I remember correctly, that's where it is. And she's lived off the grid for like a huge amount of her life in a way that's really simple and beautiful. And I've always really admired it. That's such a Saturn. That's such a great example of Saturn as well. And we forget that because we can't remember the liquid part of Saturn. We can't remember the darkening part of Saturn. So that's a lesson about Saturn, very important. Now, remember Capricorn, the sea goat, the bottom half is fishy. It's watery. So if you can start to understand Saturn prior to the advent of Neptune and prior to everyone wanting to contrast Saturn to Neptune or Saturn to Uranus or Saturn to Pluto, you just take Saturn on its own terms and understand the depth and complexity of how Saturn was understood traditionally, you will understand that the typical way that you're going to see people blasting Capricorn South Node for the next year and a half, like, oh, it's also cold, hard, work-driven, isolated, lonely, austere, dark, unfeeling, patriarchal, like you're going to hear all of that, right? Ironically, that view of Capricorn is is embodying the most shadowy, literal, obtuse, and ignorant understanding of Saturn that is out there, in my opinion. Because that's not at all that's just like one little element of what Saturn can become. But again, what does Ficino tell us? Same thing that Hillman's writing about, that Newton wrote about, that Dante was writing about, that Saturn is also the essential deterioration that's necessary for something new, for new life to come in, for there to be an understanding of the limits of the mind, of the limits of the material world that necessitate the contemplative turn of the soul from the transient back to the eternal. That's Saturn. Saturn's the rebel who inspires us to do that. He says, I'm disenchanted with this stuff. That's also Saturn. So the South Node right now can bring us, through the next year and a half, can bring us a great contemplative and mystical distance from the world. It's actually very beautiful. Can it represent all of the hard, cold Saturn stuff that we know about? Yeah, of course, right? But remember, the South Node is about a broad area in which decrease, decline, and natural Saturnine dissolution is happening. Don't forget that the South Node is not just about mistakes in the past or places where you got it wrong. The South Node is about the alchemical process of blackening, of deepening, of darkening, of dissolving, all of which were originally considered to be associated with Saturn. Remember, when Neptune is discovered, it's in an exact conjunction with Saturn in Saturn's sign of Aquarius. Just think about those things. Okay, now, how many of you have ever read the Narnia Chronicles? This is a great book exploring the planetary symbolism that C.S. Lewis embedded into all 7 of the Narnia Chronicles, which is a fantastic, just a fantastic read. And there's a documentary film that was made about it as well. So each of the 7 Chronicles of Narnia is really embedded with Saturn. And there's a whole chapter in there about how Lewis understood Saturn to be a part of his Christology, meaning his a planetary way of understanding Jesus Christ, which is very interesting if you think about it. 7 books of Narnia, they're all children's stories, but really he was embedding within them a planetary understanding of the Christ energy, the Christ consciousness. Very, very beautiful. There is, trying to find, there's a quote in here. I don't know if I'm going to find it. I didn't mark it, so I won't find it. But in here, basically, Lewis what is explained is that the last battle, which is the final book of the Narnia Chronicles, which obliterates Narnia. Narnia is like the apocalyptic moment. Narnia dies. Narnia dissolves. The god of time returns and blows the horn, and it's time for Narnia to die. But interestingly enough, Narnia is also reborn, and the liminal space between its death and rebirth includes these just vistas of contemplative genius that he was able to write into a kid's book, and that's Saturn. The liminal space between something dissolving and looking out on the edge of that oblivion, as well as contemplating what might come next, that's a sacred space that we live in, and that's Saturn's space, right? So if you ever want to listen to a song, by the way, that perfectly encapsulates Saturn, check out a band called Sleeping at Last. I'll put it in the box. The song is called Saturn. Listen to that song by Sleeping at Last called Saturn. It's a really beautiful way of capturing the essence of Saturn and this sort of vista of the divine that opens up before us when things are dissolving. Okay, so that takes us to about 41. We're at about 41 minutes, and I told you that I said we're going to take a look at the light and dark side of Saturn. Do that first. I don't want to. I feel like the moon is going to need its own time, and I want to be careful about not pushing it too much today. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to save for the third part. We're going to talk about dates and times of the eclipse in part 3, and we're going to talk about how to practically interpret the eclipses in your chart. But I think what I'll do is I will begin next talk by getting into the moon a little bit more. So we will, what we'll do is we'll start off next talk with Cancer and the sort of things that might be coming through the Cancerian North Node. What we've established so far today, again, is that in general, this kind of blackening, darkening, deepening, and contemplative qualities, as well as things like renunciation and loss and decline or decrease, the wintry qualities, they're all being really amplified with eclipses falling in Capricorn. But this is not a bad thing, and it's not something that just you should, please, if you think about the future, if you think about time as cyclical, what sense does it make, really, to think about Capricorn as the past and North Node as the future, Cancer North Node as the future? It really doesn't. Maybe it's helpful in terms of a kind of a metaphor, but I urge people to think about what Ficino said. Our soul is in the middle of all of these polarities, and we're here, and Saturn can help us. The South Node, Saturn, in the next year and a half can help us to contemplate and turn our consciousness back toward the divine, even as we go through this transient world of changes. Capricorn is here to help us with that. Saturn is here to give us that perspective that we need. So next time we'll talk about what Cancer gives us, what Cancer brings in, what the moon brings in, as well as what to beware of with the moon. So I thank you guys so much for tuning in today. I really appreciate hanging out with all of you, and I look forward to doing the next part. Hopefully over the weekend we'll touch base with part 3. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.